remember, release, reimagine, restore. This is the pattern of spiritual growth that leads to Christ. It always has been. Jesus appeared 2 times to the disciples after his resurrection in the upper room in Jerusalem. He gave them the gift of the Holy Spirit and commissioned them to continue his ministry of God's love and justice. And then they all went home. They were in Jerusalem for the Passover meal, and after the world-changing events of the crucifixion and the resurrection, they went home to Galilee. That's where our story picks up today. The disciples are home still together with Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, James, and John, and a couple of other unnamed disciples, sitting around wondering what to do. What do you do after a resurrection? Peter decided to go fishing. He was a fisherman, like James and John, the sons of Zebedee, so he did what he knew. He decided to go fishing. He decided to return to the story of his life before Christ. Remember, release, reimagine, restore. This is the pattern of spiritual growth that we repeat in life as we learn to live in God's kingdom. We remember our own stories so that we can see the patterns of our lives and see where they are different from God's story, from the story that Jesus tells us. And then we release those stories, or at least the parts that have stopped serving us. Those stories that separate us from God and from one another. The stories that separate us from living into God's money story, God's justice and compassion, God's kingdom. We reimagine our lives, working Jesus' teachings into our own lives to create new stories, new patterns of living that bring us closer to one another and to God's dream of justice and compassion for the world. And then we restore our lives in God's peace, living our reimagined stories as we follow Jesus. We set out to remember our money story so that we might live into God's money story. Now, this isn't a one-time process. We do this each time we set out to grow. Each time we want to weave our lives' story into the story of justice and peace that God is telling. This is not an easy process. The truth is, we have to surrender to God to move from living out of our story to living out of God's story. We have to be willing to trust in God, to trust in God's story, rather than the stories that we've been living from our own lives, from our own culture, the stories that we receive from the world around us. I experienced this struggle myself as I preached on the texts and themes of our stewardship campaign this year. A good story can make a great sermon. And so I'm always thinking about stories that I can share to illustrate and enliven my preaching. The first week of our stewardship story, as I contemplated my own money story, I remembered and shared with you my childhood experience of going door to door in our neighborhood, offering to wash cars and mow lawns so that I could raise money to buy a 10-speed bike. That story was formational for me. I was very proud of myself for the money that I earned, for that wonderful bike that I bought. It was only as I contemplated the story in the context of the sermon that I realized that I have been reliving that story throughout my adult life. My 12-year-old self found pride and happiness and affirmation. My parents were proud of me by working hard to earn money to buy that bike. So my 25-year-old self was desperate to buy a car and did the same thing. My 27-year-old self wanted a sailboat. My 30-year-old self wanted to own a house. We turn back to our money stories in times of struggle, in times of loss, in times of anxiety. What worked once ought to work again, and so we try doing the same things, living the same patterns over again. So I bought a new car. I bought a sailboat. I bought a house. And I liked that car. It was sweet. I liked the sailboat. It was wonderful. And the house became a home to our family. The problem was that I was going back to this story of striving and acquiring in my attempt to find meaning and purpose, happiness in my life. Each time I relived this story, I raised the stakes, buying something bigger, more expensive, not really noticing that I wasn't getting what I was seeking by reliving this pattern in my life. I was not finding peace or happiness. In my sermon on release, I told the story of the wounded eagle that walked around the pole in the center of its cage. For months, as the eagle regained its strength, recovering from an injury, it walked round the pole, round the pole, round the pole. And when the farmer, looking at the eagle, decided that it was healed, that it was strong enough, and he should let it go, he opened the door of the cage, and the eagle looked at that open door and then walked round the pole, round the pole, round the pole. And the farmer thought to himself, an eagle should be free. And so he took the walls, the cage, the very walls off of the cage. And so there was nothing left to keep that eagle trapped. And the eagle looked around himself and then walked round the pole, round the pole, round the pole. We have to reimagine our lives, reimagine our money stories, or we just keep reliving them. We keep going round the pole, round the pole, round the pole. Last week, I told the story of a poor Appalachian family. They were being visited by a social worker who was trying to help them out, and they gave him a gift. They offered him a gift of canned bear meat, of all things. And he tried to turn away the gift. But the father of the family looked at him and said, "You just have to take this. We want you to have it. We don't have much, but we ain't poor." The social worker couldn't help but ask, "What's the difference? How can you say that you're not poor when you have so very little?" And the father answered, "When you can give something away, even when you don't have much, then you ain't poor. When you don't feel easy giving something away, even when you got more than you need, then you're poor, whether you know it or not." That story helps us reimagine our own money story. I was never going to find peace or happiness if I kept striving to buy bigger, better, more expensive things. I was reliving that childhood story of buying the 10-speed bike, striving to find meaning and peace. A bike, a car, a sailboat, a house. What's next? Remember, release, reimagine, and restore. This is the pattern of spiritual growth that can lead us to Christ. It always has been there. Peter decided to go fishing because he was a fisherman. Like James and John, the sons of Zebedee, they all decided to go fishing. He decided to go back to what he knew. He decided to return to the story of his life before Christ. He decided to go round the pole, round the pole, round the pole. That's what we do. We rely on the patterns and stories of our lives. We repeat them because what worked once surely will work again. Even the stories that never deliver, we repeat. Round the pole, round the pole, round the pole. They didn't catch any fish that night. Jesus met them on the beach. He told them to cast their net on the right side of the boat. And they caught so many fish with that one cast that they could not draw the net back into the boat. And Jesus took some of those fish and cooked breakfast for them there on the beach. And then he gave Peter a new story. Feed my sheep. 3 times he confronted Peter with the question, do you love me? And 3 times Peter answered, Lord, you know that I do. And 3 times Jesus challenged him, commanded him, feed my sheep. Restore the world to God's kingdom. Live a new story. Feed my sheep. It's hard to live in God's kingdom when the world around us is telling such a different story. We form our stories in community. It's not something we do alone. We learn them from our parents and from our friends and from the society around us. And so we need to be a part of a community to successfully live into a new story. When we catch ourselves in the old money story, we remind ourselves that Jesus called Peter to feed his sheep. At St. Dunstan's church, one of the important ways we follow Jesus is by feeding people. We call ourselves the church that feeds people because we know the blessing, the peace that comes when we feed the hungry. We have become the church that feeds people. That's the story that we're living into as we strive to weave our story into God's story of justice and compassion. We're seeking to live into God's kingdom. We're working together as a congregation to make ourselves a part of God's story.